Well, we've heard about short-term results with endovascular TAAA repair, but there really is not much published on the long-term outcomes. Just to remind you, this is what we're talking about: caudally oriented cuffs. This stuff is not as new as you might think, and as a result, we really do have long-term results, although the systems have changed a little bit over the years. The homemade system has been replaced with the manufactured system, as I described earlier. And because we're treating aortic aneurysms, which tend to get longer as they get wider, we tend to end up with stent grafts that are as long as the aorta they occupy, which means that they are tortuous. And you might think that would make them unstable, but that's far from the case. If we look at all of our experience extending back, as I said, to 2000, we have never seen a case of component separation. We have seen one patient with a rupture who had a type 1 endoleak around the end of a dissected superior mesenteric artery that we could do nothing about without occluding mesenteric branches. So that was a late rupture, but it was a primary problem. We have had one patient who needed to be converted because he came back 3 years after repair with an infected stent graft. We have had one patient whose distal end of his stent graft was plugged into a rather short, previously placed bifurcated graft, and that proved to be an unstable implantation site. We simply had to add a bifurcated extension. We've had one patient whose stent graft fabric was eroded by a spicule of aortic calcification. But all in all, there is very little in the way of instability of the stent graft itself. We've had 5 patients show signs of aneurysm dilatation. All but one of those were various endoleaks that have been taken care of, and then there's another one that remains to be treated. Overall, this is what has happened to aneurysm size, pretty much what you would expect, although I have to say that measuring aneurysm diameter in type 2 thoracoabdominal aortic aneurysms is not easy. Sometimes they get bigger in one place and smaller in another, and sometimes they just change shape. It can be difficult to track. The real message here about the long-term stability of an endovascular repair with many branches is that some of those branches will occlude. We have seen no occlusions of the superior mesenteric arteries. We've seen 3 occlusions of the celiac arteries. All 3 were asymptomatic and without complications. We've seen 2 occlusions of iliac arteries, which were relatively easy to treat. The key, though, is that we've seen 18 occlusions of renal arteries in a patient experience of 115 patients. So we're talking about 15.6% of the cases. If you look at that in a little bit more detail, what you find is that only 6% of those actually resulted in the patients being on dialysis. The main reason was that most patients have 2 kidneys, but in 2 patients they actually had bilateral renal artery occlusions, and that resulted in renal failure. One patient had an occlusion of a sole renal artery, and that resulted in dialysis. And then 4 others had single renal artery occlusion with a patent renal artery on the other side, but such poor baseline function that they required dialysis. If you look at this in a life table analysis, you can see that the impression that these are happening early and then not happening later is really false. It's just that if you look at the later groups, you can see that the at-risk population is diminishing. So what is causing all of these renal artery occlusions? Well, gender is a factor. How? I do not know. It's bizarre. These women have horrible anatomy, but they do not occlude their branches. We've had 0 renal artery occlusions among the 31 women that we treated in this series. Oh, hang on. Let me go back. Another bizarre and, to my mind, inexplicable phenomenon is the fact that out of the 23 Crawford type 2 aneurysms that we have treated, we have had no renal artery thromboses. So I leave you to contemplate various hypotheses as to why that might be the case, but we really couldn't find one. We looked at the demographics and patients' baseline conditions. Renal impairment wasn't a factor. Off the shelf versus custom made didn't show any difference. Low profile versus standard profile didn't show any difference. Renal anatomy, we saw a couple of things. One was that the patients with a long renal artery tended to end up with a higher rate of thrombosis, and patients with a longer segment of renal artery that ended up being covered by the branch tended to have a slightly higher rate. I suspect that this is actually a surrogate for tortuosity, in that patients with the long renal arteries tend to have slightly coiled renal arteries. We also saw a slightly increased rate, although it didn't reach statistical significance because the group was small, among those patients who'd had upgrowing branches. And of course, there's patients like this one who has a renal aneurysm, a renal stenosis, a renal angulation, and renal stenosis and angulation on the other side. As you can see, the angulation is quite severe. This patient ended up with bilateral occlusions. He's one of only two with bilateral occlusions. So there are some things you can identify, but really there was no consistent pattern here. We didn't see an association with the renal artery or orientation, angulation, or diameter. We didn't see an association with the branch orientation, angulation, or diameter. We didn't see an association with graft diameter, whether the grafts were big, whether they were small, whether they were big relative to the arteries or small relative to the arteries. None of that panned out. And most interestingly, given the Crawford classification data, aortic diameter at the level of the renal arteries did not seem to be predictive. So what have we concluded for this? Because obviously we can't keep treating the patients in the same way with this known experience. Well, the first thing I think we concluded was we shouldn't be putting stiff branches deep into long renal arteries. The fluency stent grafts that we use are very stiff. They are prone to kinking. We line them with wall stents. That makes them less prone to kinking, but stiffer. So what tends to happen is the kink moves from the middle of the renal artery where the graft is to the end of the graft. So you'll see the graft and then there'll be an acute angulation. We tend to regard a single renal artery now as a relative contraindication to repair. If the patient's going to have a 15% risk of thrombosing that renal artery, then they have a 15% risk of renal failure. I don't think that's something to be contemplated in a healthy patient. Poor renal function, similarly, we regard as a relative contraindication to repair because under those circumstances, single renal occlusion can result in dialysis. And we've tried to look at the components of our device. And one of the conclusions we reached was that we could actually make the device far more flexible if we substituted Viabonds for fluencies. Now, Viabonds are not without problems. They only come in 5 centimeter and 10 centimeter lengths. They are almost invisible once they're deployed. They are actually not terribly easy tools to use. But in our experience so far, we have not seen any thromboses. So if any of you have any sudden flashes of insight and you realize what I've presented to you that tells you the answer to this conundrum, feel free to let me know. Thank you.